Well, my energy level was awfully low last night, which may be the reason that not only did I not get to some things I really wanted to talk about, but the things that I most wanted to talk about and I thought were the main reasons that I asked you to read these two texts, and particularly why I asked you to read them together. And the main point is to think about why we read as academics. Now, obviously, there are lots of reasons to read. One, because we enjoy reading. This is why most of us became English majors. And often the kinds of things we enjoy reading. For some of you, that's primarily literature. I find I read less and less literature over the years because I actually enjoy reading this other stuff. I actually get more out of these theoretical works nowadays than I do out of literature. But that's not why we read academically. So I want to talk about both what I think is not academic reading and then what I think is academic reading, as illustrated both by these two readings and by your responses to them. I saw basically three kinds of responses. The most basic one is, here is what I understand. For a couple of you, actually, I thought were some really good responses, which were, okay, I've read this and there's some interesting stuff going on, but I don't understand. There's a sense in which that is actually a good academic way of reading, and that ties really well, I think, into Peirce's idea about belief and doubt. As academics, we don't read to believe, we read to doubt. That's what we're looking for, is doubt, and I'll get back to that later. The second kind of response I saw was, I agree or I disagree. Why? Not quite a few, but several of you really disagreed with Peirce. And Catherine in particular, you really didn't like his overemphasis, and I agree with you, there's a strong overemphasis on science in this particular article. But as academics, that's not why we read. One of the problems with politics today is most people only read what they agree with or watch what they agree with. They only watch Fox, or they only watch CNN, or they only read Fox Online, or they only read the Huffington Post. And they don't spend any time in disbelief, right? Or doubt, I guess is the term. They don't spend any time in doubt. They spend all their time in belief. And in that respect, Peirce is right on. He really describes the current political news today. One of the other kinds of responses I saw was, how does this fit into my theory? How does this fit into my theoretical perspective? And if it does, fine, and if it doesn't, push it aside. That fits, I think, into the doubt belief again. And you're welcome to think about which one of these nice, neat categories Peirce puts it in. Like most or many early 19th century or I guess it'd be late 19th century, early 20th century writers, he's very, very comfortable with neat categories, which we're not as comfortable with anymore. But as a reader, I always look at the rhetorical situation within which somebody like that works. But let's talk about now, these are in some ways not academic ways of reading, but can turn into academic ways of reading, and I've certainly seen that, over and over again in journal articles, and but I don't necessarily advise it, and certainly not what I want to teach. But I'm going to talk about two ways of doing academic reading that I do think are useful and do want to teach. Number one is, how can I use this? Right? And that was really obvious. For most of us, it was really quickly we could see that Peirce described, even though he'd never read this article, hadn't even imagined something like Asian rhetoric, he explained what was going on in the deficiency model very, very clearly, and it was provided a really good way to talk about that model, right, and to discuss it and how it got there and why it got there, other than just simply saying that it's politically incorrect, right, or that it doesn't pay attention to the other. So it provided a good way to talk about that. So how we can use that. And often we read stuff precisely for that reason, to see how does it plug in to what we're doing. That's a use model. And that's a perfectly acceptable model for academic writing. We use it all the time. Now there's one prerequisite for that model, and that is that you're actually listening to who you're reading. If you're doing one of those other models, do I agree or disagree? Does it fit into my theory? Even do I understand it? We have problems using it because we never quite figure out what they're trying to say. But a more important model, or better model for academic reading, is to enter into conversation. How do I enter into conversation with Peirce? You know, here's this 22, 23-year-old Victorian gentleman. Very much so. Right? You probably noticed the gender-specific language in here. Would have never occurred to these people to invite a woman to the metaphysical club. How do I enter into conversation with this person? If I sat down with them next to them at Starbucks and noticed what they were reading. Something that actually happened to me a couple of weeks ago. I was reading Pragmatism and Religion, and a gentleman sat down next to me and started asking me about the book. He turned out to be a very conservative fundamentalist, and we had actually what turned into a very acrimonious conversation. But we had a conversation. He listened to me, I listened to him. At the end, we discovered we couldn't agree with each other. And I think that's a very, very important model for academic reading, right? Is to listen to those people we're reading, enter into conversation with them. And often that's the stepping stone to use, right? Because that forces us to think, right? And that places us in doubt. As an academic, belief doesn't do us a whole lot of good. Doubt does. I think we were talking a little bit about religion earlier. We sort of skirted over that issue. Religion is an uncomfortable topic in the academy. And I've been part of that, wondering about both what it is and why it's so uncomfortable myself. And it occurs to me that it is uncomfortable because in order to have that conversation, you have to be in a state of doubt. Not a state of disbelief, not skepticism. That's a whole different ballgame. And we could talk about that if you want to next week. Peirce was very critical of skepticism. But both sides have to be in a state of doubt. Both the academic who is a believer and the academic who's not a believer have to be in a state of doubt about their own position. That's the big reason to read Peirce, to recognize that as an academic, the biggest value we can have is to at least be in doubt about our own position and be willing to recognize that there are other people just as smart as we are who have a different belief, have a different idea. If we can do that, we can become very good academic readers and very good academic writers. So that's the lecture that I didn't give last night. I hope it was useful today.